200 of them stood on the summit of Mount Hermon and made a pact, not a prayer, not a vow of devotion, a pact sworn between themselves, binding each one to the others, so that no single angel could lose his nerve and return to heaven alone while the rest faced the consequences of what they were about to do. They understood exactly what they were choosing. They understood it could not be undone. They swore the oath anyway, and they descended. This is not in the Bible the way most people know it. It is older than the Bible as most people know it. It comes from the Book of Enoch, a text so ancient, so strange, and so deeply unsettling to the later religious authorities who inherited it that it was eventually removed from the canon of Scripture entirely, kept alive only in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, and buried in caves in the Judean desert where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, waiting almost 2,000 years for someone to dig it out and read it again. What it contains is one of the most extraordinary and disturbing stories in all of ancient religious literature. The story of the Watchers, the angels stationed above the earth to observe humanity, and what happened when observation became desired. In the earliest layers of Israelite and Second Temple Jewish belief, the heavens were not empty. They were populated, organized, structured, filled with categories of divine beings assigned to specific functions in the operation of the cosmos. Some moved the stars, some governed the weather, some stood before the divine throne and did nothing but burn with worship, and some watched. The Watchers, Iron in Aramaic, were the angels assigned to observe the earth and its inhabitants, to keep vigil, to stand between the divine realm and the human one, present in both, but belonging fully to neither, perceiving everything that happened below while remaining above it. The Book of Enoch names their leader as Semyaza. Under him, grouped in 20s with their own chiefs, 200 watchers carried out their function at the boundary between heaven and earth, watching the daughters of men, watching the cities grow, watching the ceremonies and the harvests and the wars and the grief. And watching became something else. The text says it plainly without apology. The sons of heaven saw the daughters of men and desired them in the full, physical, irreversible sense of the word. Not as a passing temptation, they resisted and moved past. As a hunger, they chose to feed. Semyaza, their chief, was afraid, not of the act itself, afraid of being the only one to carry the blame if the others lost their courage. So he gathered them on Mount Hermon, the great peak at the northern edge of the land of Canaan, the mountain whose name in Hebrew carries the root of the word for sacred oath, for binding vow, for the kind of promise that cannot be unmade. He made them swear together, all 200. Every name is recorded in the text. Semyaza, Uraqaba, Ramiel, Kokabeel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Daniel, Ezekiel, Barakijel, Asael, Armoros, Batariel, Ananel, Zakiel, Samsapeel, Satariel, Turiel, Jomjel, Sariel. Their names are preserved because the Book of Enoch believed names mattered, that to name something was to make it real, to hold it accountable, to prevent it from dissolving back into rumor and legend where no one could be charged with what they had done. They swore, they descended, and the world was never the same. The Watchers took wives from among the daughters of men. The text is explicit about this. These were not visions or spiritual encounters. These were physical unions between divine beings who had descended into material form and mortal women who lived in the world below. But the unions were only part of what the Watchers brought with them. They taught. This is the detail that distinguishes the Book of Enoch from a simple story of transgression and punishment. The Watchers did not simply descend and take what they wanted. They gave things in return, or what appeared to be gifts, what functioned as gifts, but which the text regards as something more like contamination. Semyaza taught the art of enchantments and the cutting of roots, herb lore, the manipulation of natural forces through sacred formula. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments, how to break the spells of others, how to reverse and undo what had been woven with sacred language. Archangel taught astrology, the reading of the stars, the understanding of celestial movements as a language, carrying information about what would happen on Earth below. Kokabeel taught the knowledge of the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Meteorology as sacred science, the understanding of weather as a readable text written across the sky. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. And Azazel, perhaps the most significant of all the Watchers in terms of what the text blames on him, taught men how to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He taught the working of metals into weapons. He taught women the art of beautification, the use of antimony for the eyes, of ornaments, of the cosmetic arts that made the human body into a decorated, adorned, desirable object, rather than simply a functional one. The text's position on all of this is stark and consistent. The Watchers ruined the world, not because knowledge is evil, but because humanity was not ready, had not been given these things by the divine, had not earned them through the gradual accumulation of wisdom, had received instead a flood of power and capability that overwhelmed the moral and spiritual development necessary to use any of it wisely. Weapons appeared before human beings had learned to resolve conflict without them. Astrological knowledge arrived before the humility necessary to hold it without arrogance. The arts of seduction and adornment poured into a world that was already struggling with desire and violence, and made both worse. The earth, the Book of Enoch says, brought its accusation up to heaven. The cry of the ruined world reached the 4 great archangels, Michael, Uriel, Gabriel, Raphael, and they heard it and they brought it before the divine throne. But before the judgment came, the children were born. The offspring of the Watchers and the daughters of men were not human, were not divine, were something the world had never seen and had not been designed to contain, beings of enormous stature, consuming appetites, and a nature that did not fit inside the categories that govern the rest of creation. The Book of Enoch gives their height as 300 cubits in some traditions, measurements so vast they read less like literal dimensions and more like an attempt to express in numbers a being whose size exceeded the human capacity to absorb it through ordinary perception. They ate everything. When the food of humanity ran out, they turned to the animals. When the animals ran out, they turned to humanity itself. And when that was not enough, they turned on each other. Their name, Nephilim, appears in the book of Genesis as well, in one of the most compressed and cryptic passages in all of Scripture. The sons of God came to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. That is the entirety of what Genesis says. 2 verses and a reference that has generated more theological debate, more scholarly argument, more popular fascination than almost any other passage in the Hebrew Bible. The Book of Enoch expands those 2 verses into an entire cosmology of consequence. The Nephilim were not destroyed when they died. Their bodies fell, but the spirits that animated them, neither fully angelic nor fully human, belonging to no assigned place in the order of things, claimed by neither heaven nor the underworld's established categories, remained. They wandered the earth as something the ancient texts called evil spirits, or unclean spirits, or simply spirits of the giants, incorporeal, hungry, unable to eat, unable to drink, unable to fulfill through a body any of the hungers they had inherited from their Watcher fathers and their human mothers, and therefore endlessly seeking bodies that were not their own, entering wherever they found a gap, producing on the earth a category of affliction and corruption that had not existed before the Watchers descended. This is the origin, in the Book of Enoch's cosmology, of demonic possession, of the category of being that later traditions would call demons, not fallen angels themselves, but the orphaned offspring of the union between angels and humanity, wandering and hungry and belonging nowhere. The 4 archangels received their assignments from the divine council and carried them out. Raphael was sent to bind Azazel. He was to be bound hand and foot, thrown into the darkness, his face covered, so he could no longer see the light, and cast into a rough and jagged place in the desert called Dudiel, where he was to remain until the final judgment, covered in rough and pointed stones, in darkness, with fire sent upon him at the end to consume everything his teaching had produced. Gabriel was sent against the children of the Watchers, to destroy the Nephilim by setting them against each other, to let their own nature consume them, to send them into war with one another until no one remained. He did not need to fight them. He simply removed whatever restraint had been holding the Nephilim's violence in incomplete check, and they tore each other apart. Michael was sent to Semyaza and all his companions, to bind them under the hills of the earth for 70 generations, in valleys of fire, until the day of their judgment, when they would be led into the abyss of fire forever. And Uriel was sent to Noah, to tell him what was coming, to tell him to hide himself and his family from the devastation that was about to pour across the earth. The flood that would come to wash away everything the Watchers had contaminated, to close the wound they had opened in the order of creation by carrying what belonged in heaven down into a world that had not been built to hold it. The flood, in this reading, was not primarily a punishment for human sin. It was a cleansing of the Nephilim, a resetting of a world that had been fundamentally altered by a category of being that should never have existed, that could not be simply corrected or reformed, that had produced by its very existence a disruption too deep for anything less than the complete dissolution and restart that water provides. The Book of Enoch circulated across the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world for centuries. Fragments have been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The author of the New Testament letter of Jude quotes it directly, treating it as authoritative scripture. Early Christian writers referenced it and wrestled with it, and eventually, by the 4th and 5th centuries, largely set it aside, troubled perhaps by what it implied about the nature of angels, about the boundary between divine and human, about the origin of evil as something that arrived in the world not from below but from above. But the story survived. In Ethiopia, where the complete text of the Book of Enoch was preserved in the Guizi language across more than 1,000 years, it was never lost. When Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 copies back from Abyssinia in 1773, and when Richard Lawrence published the first English translation in 1821, the Western world encountered for the first time the complete account of what the sons of God had done on Mount Hermon, and what the world had looked like in the centuries before the flood. What the story describes, angels crossing a boundary they were made to observe, teaching what should not have been taught, producing beings that the categories of the cosmos could not contain, and leaving behind spirits that wandered hungry through the world ever after, is one of the oldest accounts in recorded religious literature of what happens when power flows into a space before the wisdom necessary to hold it has been established. The Watchers saw humanity and descended, 200 of them, sworn together on a mountain, choosing in full knowledge what they were giving up and what they were unleashing. And the world they left behind was different from the one they found, armed, adorned, astrologically literate, and haunted by the children of what they had done, wandering still through every tradition that inherited even a fragment of this oldest, strangest, most uncomfortable story about the night heaven's boundary was crossed from above.